So again, this is important because you will need it for your final writing assignment. We're going to start with Anselm's definition of God. And notice that both Anselm and Descartes do give a definition of God for their argument. And in fact, their argument cannot work unless there's some conception or definition of God. And so we do have that here with Anselm. Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. That's the definition of God. That than which nothing greater can be thought. You might say that another way to express that is to say that God is the greatest thing that anyone can think of, right? God is the greatest thing that anyone can think of. That's another way to express that, right? So the first premise then states that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind alone. Now keep in mind the form of the argument. The form of the argument is a reductio ad absurdum. So given what we just talked about in terms of what the reductio ad absurdum is, remember we have to start with the opposite of what we're trying to prove and show that that leads to a contradiction. And because that leads to a contradiction, then we have to accept that original statement. Well, you might not see it here, but basically saying that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind alone is basically another way of saying God only exists in the mind, right? Which is basically another way of saying God does not exist in reality. So if you think about it, this is the negation of God existing, right? It's basically saying God only exists in the mind, which is to say that God does not exist in reality. And so we can translate that to mean God does not exist. That is to say, God does not exist in reality. So because Anselm is employing the reductio ad absurdum here, he has to show that this statement here, this first premise, leads to a contradiction. Because if this leads to a contradiction, then it is not true that God exists in the mind alone. Basically, it also would have to be true that God exists in reality. But again, remember that definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the... the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. That's the definition of God. And so the first premise is basically saying that than which nothing greater can be thought does not exist in reality. Why? Because it exists in the mind alone, right? That's the first premise. He now has to show us why this will eventually lead to a contradiction. So we have allegedly a reductio ad absurdum here, right? Which is what we've been talking about. Okay, well, premise 2 says this. It says, but that than which nothing greater can be thought can be conceived to exist in reality. And so let's take a moment there to understand exactly what premise 2 is saying. Let me just repeat it. And let's think about it for a second. But that than which nothing greater can be thought can be conceived to exist in reality. And this is what that means. Basically what that means is we can think of a circumstance in which that than which nothing greater can be we can think of a circumstance in which that which nothing greater can be thought can exist in reality, even though we do not believe that it actually obtains. So basically it's just another way of saying we can conceive of that than which nothing greater we can think of or conceive of that than which nothing greater can be thought to actually also exist in reality. That's what that second premise is saying. It's conceivable that that than which nothing greater can be thought can also exist in reality. That's all that premise is saying. Okay, let's go to premise 3. Premise 3 basically says, but it is greater for a thing to exist in reality than for it to exist in the mind alone. Okay, it is greater for a thing to exist in reality than for it to exist in the mind alone. That's the statement in premise 3. Okay, let me keep going. Premise 4 says, hence that than which nothing greater can be thought is such that something greater can be thought, namely that being which exists in the mind and in reality. And it's in premise 3 that we get that idea that there can be that in which nothing greater can be thought, that also exists in reality, right? I'm sorry, it's premise 2 where we get that. In premise 3, we get this kind of principle that it's better or greater to actually also be in reality. Okay, so now it's in premise 4 that we get the alleged contradiction. So again, remember, we're building up to a contradiction here, and it's in premise 4 where we get that alleged contradiction. Why? Well, premise 4 says that in which nothing greater can be thought is such that something greater can be thought. Right? That in which nothing greater can be thought is such that something greater can be thought. And that is the alleged contradiction. And so premise 5 basically says, but that is absurd, which is another way of saying this is absurd. This leads to an absurd conclusion, which again, remember, this means, this is a reductio ad absurdum, right? And so because premise 4 has shown us the contradiction explicitly, remember, the whole goal here is to show that the beginning premise, which remember basically said that God does not exist in reality, well, then we do have to accept that God does exist. And so in the conclusion of the argument, we get the statement that premise 1 must be false. And again, remember what premise 1 was saying. Premise 1 was saying that in which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind alone, right? Which is another way of saying that God does not exist in reality. God only exists in the mind, because we have a definition of God. So the conclusion basically says, okay, because this has led us to an absurdity, which we get fully manifested in premise 4. Premise 5 says that's absurd. Then because we have that reductio ad absurdum here, we have to conclude then that premise 1 is false. But remember, what premise 1 was saying is that God does not exist, therefore God has to exist. And so the conclusion might as well just say God exists. But remember, God was being defined as that in which nothing greater can be thought. That was the definition of God to begin with. So then the conclusion is that in which nothing greater can be thought must exist in reality as well as in the mind, which is another way of saying that then, God does exist in reality. That's the conclusion. And so hopefully the overall structure of the argument is clear. Now let's talk about its validity. Well, remember that the definition of validity is that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, right? Go back to the videos on validity earlier in the semester, and that is how validity is defined. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. That's the definition of validity. Well, never mind about the truth of the premises now. Remember, in order to test whether the argument is good, whether it's sound or not, we want it to be sound because we also want the premises to be true. We should always start with validity. I told you Descartes' argument was valid, right? You had to kind of just trust me. It's valid. In order for this argument to be valid, we do have to have a reductio ad absurdum. And why is that? Well, because that's the form of the argument, right? We assume that something is true. We show that it leads to a contradiction. Once we show that it leads to a contradiction, then we have to accept the opposite. And that's just the logical form of a reductio ad absurdum. So we really do have to have a reductio ad absurdum in order for this argument to be valid. The problem here is that it's not obvious that we have a reductio ad absurdum. It looked like we did. But look at premise 4. What I did here at the bottom is copy premise 4. And notice that what we have here is actually not. Remember, let's suppose that n is nothing greater can be thought is n. We would have to have n and not n. Remember that's the dot. I don't have the dot in front of me anymore, but dot and dot tilde n, right? That would be the contradiction, right? Let me see if I can insert the dot here. Basically, we would have to have n dot tilde n, right? That would be the true contradiction, because remember what I said earlier, in order for this to be a true contradiction, we have to have a statement and its exact opposite. And the question here is, do we have that? Well, let's look at premise 4 to see if that is truly a contradiction. It's hence that which nothing greater can be thought is such that something greater can be thought. Namely that, again, the way we summarize that is that being exists in the mind and in reality. Well, as it turns out, that statement is not quite a contradiction. Why is that? Well, because let's look at the statement in terms of subject and predicate. Remember, we would need and dot not and for a real contradiction. I'm gonna put this in the video. I won't have time to do it in both computers. I'll put it in the video to show you what the true contradiction is. So go back and look at the video to see what that, remember, is n dot not n, to show that we really had a true contradiction. What do we really have in that premise 4? Hence, that which nothing greater can be thought is such that something greater can be thought. If you think about it, we only have one statement in premise 4. We don't have a statement conjoined with its opposite. So we don't have n dot not n. We don't have that in premise 4. Why is that? Well, we basically only have one statement. Let me show you why we only have one statement. The subject in that statement is that in which nothing greater can be thought. That's the subject, right? Let me highlight that. The statement in that premise has a subject, which is hence, well, that in which something greater can be thought. That's the subject. The predicate, notice we have the is, right? So we have a statement of the form like P is blah blah blah, right? Or T is blah blah blah. It's only a predicate, a subject and predicate, which basically means that that we only have one statement. But remember, in order for us to have the contradiction, we need two statements, one with its opposite, right? One statement with its negation. But here as it turns out, we only have one statement. We only have a subject and a predicate, which means that we only have one statement, right? All statements have a subject and a predicate. In this case, we basically have that in which nothing greater can be thought is the subject, and the predicate is such that something greater can be thought, right? The subject is that in which nothing greater can be thought. That's the subject. The predicate is such that something greater can be thought, right? That's the predicate. We have a subject and we have a predicate, which is to say we only have one statement. We do not have a statement conjoined with its negation. And so it looks like we don't even really have a valid argument here, because we don't have that true form of a reductio ad absurdum. So I hope that makes sense. Again, this goes very nicely with the proofs that you're doing, especially the last proofs that you're doing, because if you understand how that's working logically, you understand now why this premise here that's supposed to give us the contradiction doesn't really do that. Okay, any questions?